I'm Hemant Mehta.
And I'm Jessica Blimke.
And you're listening to the podcast for FriendlyAtheist.com. You can now listen to all of our episodes and see show notes at FriendlyAtheistPodcast.com. If you've ever seen VeggieTales, you're familiar with Phil Vischer. He's the animator, puppeteer, writer, voice actor, and songwriter who co-created that series. His production company grew to over 200 workers by the year 2000 before a lawsuit sent the company into bankruptcy and forced Phil to basically start over again. But he now runs Jellyfish Labs, where he produces faith-based content. He also hosts the Phil Vischer Podcast, which is a very entertaining show, and I know because he was kind enough to invite me on it, all about Christianity in a post-Christian America. So, Phil, thanks for joining us. And this is going to seem like an odd question to ask you, but because our audience is mostly atheists, what the hell is VeggieTales?
Well, that's a good question. VeggieTales is basically animated vegetables reenacting Bible stories.
So the two things children love, vegetables and church?
Which I recognize makes no sense whatsoever. It wasn't supposed to make sense. Here's how it happened. I was a computer animator in Chicago around 1990, 1991. I was living in the city doing a lot of commercial work, and I was trying to figure out, I was noticing that more and more media did not reflect what I referred to at the time as Sunday school values. You know, the values I'd heard and learned on Sunday morning. I thought, okay, could I do something for kids that taught them basically the values of Sunday morning, Sunday school values, but in a way that felt more like Saturday morning, which for me as a kid was cartoons. So I was playing around with characters. I had to come up with really simple characters that I could afford to animate. And that was a trick in 1990 computer animation. So they couldn't have arms, legs, hair, or clothes. Those were the technical limits. And so I started playing around with a candy bar. And I thought, okay, Mr. Candy Bar, and maybe if I can bring this character to life affordably, then he can somehow tell Bible stories. And I had just brought Mr. Candy Bar to life. I just got married about 6 months before then, and my wife walked by and saw a candy bar on the computer screen and said, moms are going to be mad if you make their kids fall in love with candy bars. And I thought, good heavens, she's right. Well, what wouldn't moms be mad about their kids falling in love with that's shaped like a candy bar? And the next thing that popped into my head was a cucumber. So I had the cucumber, and he was tall and skinny, and I needed someone short and round to be a sidekick. So I came up with a tomato and named them Bob and Larry, and that was 1993. We were actually working out of a storefront on the north side of Chicago at the time. Launched it in 1993. It went into Christian bookstores only at first in 1994. We sold about 50,000 copies across the country in Christian bookstores. And then people started noticing just how weird it was because we had, Monty Python references, and we'd parody Star Trek and parody Gilligan's Island and just do all these weird things that people were not used to seeing in religious children's videos. And then it took off, and we started getting press and, mainstream newspapers and magazines and TV. And suddenly I was on CNN, and then the thing just exploded, and then Walmart wanted to carry it, and Target wanted to carry it. And by the year 2000, we'd sold 30 million VeggieTales videos. So it's today, as of today, I think they keep on selling, even though I'm no longer involved. They've sold about 65 million VeggieTales videos. It was parodied by Saturday Night Live. It's been referenced on 5 different episodes of The Simpsons. It just kind of went crazy.
And so I don't need to rehash everything that you went through, but for whatever reason, as the company expanded, the business grew, the lawsuits came, or whatever, a lawsuit came. I'm more curious because I think I've heard you say there was a lawsuit. You guys had to go into bankruptcy, even though you won the case on appeal. Tell me if I'm wrong about that, but I'm really curious how you overcame that, how you kind of started over after you had such a massive hit.
Yeah, we basically, the mistake I made was I wanted to do as much good as I could as fast as I could. And the way I looked at it was that Hollywood was giving kids, what I would consider Twinkies. Hollywood was giving them Power Rangers and this violent stuff, and then stuff that was just designed to sell toys. And I was trying to give them, wholesome values. So I thought the more I can do, the faster, the better. So whenever we made more money off selling videos, I hired more people. I hired more animators. I hired more artists. I put more people to work. And I just kept hiring until I basically spent the company into bankruptcy. And there was a lawsuit. We made our own feature film, Jonah, a VeggieTales movie, which became the highest grossing Christian movie of all time until Mel Gibson decided to make a Christian movie the next year. And that was the end of that record. But it slipped into bankruptcy in 2003 because I didn't want to let anyone go, even when I realized we were running out of money. And so I ended up with nothing and then had to start over again and kind of went back to a blank piece of paper to say, okay, because I don't know if you know about this, but I'm a Christian.
What?
I don't know if I've mentioned that. You may not have invited me on the podcast if you knew that. But anyway.
You had 666 in your phone number. I had no idea.
I am a religious person, and so I really felt that it was a call from God. Like, he wants me to do this. And what was amazing, and this is when I tell people my story, my assumption was, and I was working so hard, I was killing myself, physically. It was affecting my relationships. I'd really become kind of miserable running on this, George Jetson treadmill of I got to keep making the veggies. I got to keep making the veggies because it's what God wants me to do. And when the whole thing fell apart, I was like, okay, God, this doesn't make any sense. Don't you see how hard I was working? And what I realized, and this was through about 3 months of really extensive prayer and reading the Bible and saying, okay, what was wrong with what I was doing? I felt like he pointed out to me how miserable I had become and that me being healthy and happy was more important to him than me, doing this amazing thing for him and killing myself.
I was really hoping you were going to say you figured out that God hated vegetables, and I was just super excited for that.
I don't see that. No, I don't see that theologically. So I started over again and went back to a blank piece of paper and said, all right, what was I trying to do in the first place? I'm just really trying to, help parents share the Bible with their kids and teach them what's in it. So I went back to nothing and started a new series called What's in the Bible, which is, we describe it as the Muppets Go to Seminary. But it's basically a mix. I needed to do it for a smaller budget. So it's a mix of puppets and animation and then me teaching on camera. And we walk families all the way through the Bible from Genesis to Revelation. And I have no problem whatsoever if someone rejects the Bible once they know what's in it. I don't like it when people reject it without ever opening it. So I'm trying to walk families all the way through the Bible and say, this is what's in it. Now, what you do with it is entirely up to you.
I know there are some, shall we say, untoward parts of the Bible that maybe aren't family friendly. Which I don't
know what you're talking about.
No. I mean, we must be reading a different Bible then. I'm sorry, that's on me.
Yeah. No, with VeggieTales, we actually taught the story of David and Bathsheba to kids, which was one of my favorite episodes.
Some fancy footwork you got there.
Story, David, he's a king. He's got whatever he wants. He sees a hot chick bathing on a rooftop and says, I want her too. And so he takes her, sleeps with her, gets her pregnant, and then because her husband is coming home, is going to find out, has her husband murdered. It's a great story.
Okay, seriously.
Someone suggested the idea of retelling it as it's called King George and the Bath Ducky. And it's a king he's literally on his rooftop, and he sees a little kid taking a bath with a rubber ducky. And King George collects rubber duckies. He has all the rubber duckies he wants and needs, but he decides he wants this little kid's rubber ducky. So he takes the rubber ducky and then has the little kid sent out to the battlefield to be creamed at the pie war and has him creamed in a pie war.
Do you get in trouble? Do you get in trouble with biblical literalists?
Hold on. What moral are kids taking from this?
It was about greed. It was a story about greed he had, and that's when in the Bible story when Nathan the prophet
Phil, there's
comes
so
out,
many good stories about greed that don't involve somebody dying in a pie war.
He doesn't die; he gets knocked silly. So that's
just like Jesus wanted.
Phil.
We have. I mean, there are people who like their Bible stories completely literal. Tell it exactly the way it's told in the Bible. And to them, because when Daniel went down in the lion's den in our version, the lions shared pizza with him. And then we had people say, "Hey, that's not in the Bible." And I say, "We know, but what is sacred about the story, we're honoring." And then we, kind of go in our version of Joshua in the Battle of Jericho. We put French peas on the walls of Jericho because they reminded us of the Frenchmen from Monty Python and the Holy Grail. So they're, the Israelites are marching around the walls, and then the French peas are like, well, what are they doing? Just staring at them? I thought, no, they're throwing slushies at them. So they have, big giant slushy cups, and they dump them on the Israelites. We thought that was kind of funny.
Let me stem off of what Jessica asked, because it's one thing to retell a Bible story in a way that maybe gets the message across without necessarily getting into all the R-rated, what's the word?
Carnage?
Yes.
Yes.
What about the controversial issues that Christians often have to deal with? Things like that we see in the culture wars, homosexuality, abortion. Do you ever tackle those issues using kind of your animation, your characters, anything like that? Or did you stick to we're just going to retell these stories in a way that's more palatable to children?
Depends on what age you're talking to. Because VeggieTales was primarily targeted at preschool age kids, those are topics that parents don't want you introducing to their kids around them. So those are, I want to talk to my kids about homosexuality. I don't necessarily want an animated tomato talking to my kids.
Well, an animated cucumber would definitely get awkward.
Oh, God.
Yeah, I wasn't even going to go there.
You're welcome.
But thank you very much.
You're welcome.
There was the Los Angeles Reader decided that Bob the Tomato and Larry the Cucumber standing together and turned sideways were very obviously male genitalia, and that's what we were behind all the time.
So again, what did they think your end goal was?
Yeah, right. So you talked about
now, when we get to what's in the Bible, which is geared towards like 3rd, 4th, 5th grade kids. Then we're getting into more of the controversial issues of the Bible. We're talking about, why was it okay for the Israelites to kill all those Canaanites? What's with all the weird rules in the book of Leviticus? And why do we say we have to obey some, but we don't say we have to obey others?
Actually, I have all those questions.
Those are fun things to try to explain.
I mean, and I'm not necessarily interested in getting into a theological debate on this stuff, but how do you you're running a business. How do you tackle those issues in a way that doesn't piss off a whole bunch of Christians? Because you're screwed no matter what you say, because they don't all agree on these issues. So how do you even approach that? I live in Wheaton, Illinois, right by Wheaton College. Friends of mine work at Christianity Today magazine. That's really the birthplace of the American evangelical movement, modern evangelicalism. Christianity Today was founded by Billy Graham because he wanted to respond to liberal Christian publications like the Christian Century. So, but he didn't want to be fundamentalist like Bob Jones University and some others. So he was trying to find a middle ground, a way to be orthodox Christian and also intellectually curious. And that was the founding of Christianity Today magazine, which came, right out of Wheaton College here in the western suburbs of Chicago. So I strike a balance of aiming for what I call centrist evangelicalism, although I probably tend to veer towards the side of progressive evangelicalism, and how you parse those things out is very complex. But I take the Bible very seriously. And this is where I will lose people. For example, I don't believe in a literal young earth. I don't believe that the Bible says the earth is 6,000 years old. And no one in the science department at Wheaton College believes that the earth is 6,000 years old. There's a woolly mammoth that Wheaton College students found in Glen Ellen and dug out and restored, and it's on display in the Science Museum, and it says right below it on a label, it lived about 20,000 years ago.
Oh, cool.
So I lose people fairly quickly if they are absolutely militant about the idea of a young Earth, which would be the Ken Ham Creation Museum crowd. And I just have to make peace with that I lose those people.
It's okay to lose those people.
There are more progressive theological Christians that, have given up on the notion of really taking the Bible literally, like it's historical, of taking miracles seriously. And, evangelicalism, centrist evangelicalism does take those things seriously. So I take those things seriously when I teach, and we'll lose some people who say, oh, no, come on. You can't really expect us to believe that. And I say, no, I actually do. So you just have to be aware of, if you're going to offend someone, at least know it ahead of time. So you're not
That's how I live my life.
And then, because it is a business where I'm spending money and, from investors, and I have to figure out a way to give it back. Whenever I'm going to tell a story or teach something, I just have to figure out, okay, how big is the audience for this? If I'm taking this tack, if I'm going to lose all of Ken Ham's fans, or if I'm going to lose, the Princeton seminary crowd, what do I have left? And then how much can I spend on this video? And if I can't, afford to tell the story for the audience I think I've got, well, then I don't tell a story.
That's a really interesting line you have to walk there.
Oh, it's nothing but fun. No, I actually enjoy the challenge because it's like if you have infinite money to make something, it can be overwhelming, or infinite resources to make something. But if someone says, all right, you've got 7
boundaries.
crayons, so you have to make a picture with 7 colors, and you've got a piece of paper that's exactly this big. I enjoy the creative challenge of, and that's why with What's in the Bible, VeggieTales, those budgets could get as big as about $1 million an episode because it was all CGI animation and it was, very well done. And I knew I couldn't spend that much on What's in the Bible because I was being more narrow. I was being more specific theologically, and that it would probably never end up in Walmart. So instead of CGI animation, I went with puppets and then some limited flash animation. And you just, you choose the tools. Don't worry so much about the tools and the budget. Just worry about what you're trying to accomplish and then find a way to do it.
So let's talk about something that I know you know something about, which is Christian media. Why is it that most of the Christian media we tend to see are like D-rated? Oh my God. It's just shit. Sorry, I can swear. It's my show. They're shitty versions of secular media. And I mean, obviously, like you said, you're referencing Monty Python. You're obviously doing something right. You're connecting with people.
He just called you a shitty version of Monty Python.
No, that's not what I'm saying. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying it worked. I'm saying it worked for you. But for some reason, so much of Christian media that we see are just really horrible. I mean, why haven't they figured this out yet? Because it's not like money.
Why is it so bad?
Yes, they have money. They have resources. Why are Christian?
It takes more than money. I mean, how many big budget films are terrible that come out of Hollywood? So money isn't it. There are two. I'll give you 2 reasons. Reason number 1, in the conservative Christian world, up until about 30 years ago, for many people, movies were still considered evil. My grandparents never set foot in a movie theater. That would have been like going to a bordello, or they also, they wouldn't play cards, so there was this strictness, and it came out of the holiness movement, which was the Methodists in England, and it came over and spread, and for about 200 years, conservative Christians became very concerned about specific behaviors, and that's where we get sayings like, don't smoke, don't drink, don't chew, don't go with girls that do. It's like there were whole lists of things that Christians weren't supposed to do, and going to movies was one of them because movies historically came out of vaudeville and burlesque, on the East Coast. And a good Christian would never go into a vaudeville house or a burlesque house. Those were sins of iniquity, dens of iniquity. So since movie theaters, initially they were converted vaudeville theaters and burlesque houses. So around the 1900s, 1910s, a good Christian would never associate with that whole industry. as a result, we told our kids, no, and you're not going to go to movies either. And so we had whole generations of kids that kind of sat out from that stream of entertainment, and we don't have those muscles to do that stuff. So we sent our kids to Africa to be missionaries, but not to Hollywood to go to film school.
But I mean, that makes sense.
That makes sense.
That makes sense 20, 30 years ago. But clearly the newer generation, I mean, they did watch films.
We're getting better.
We're getting better. So
slowly better. Here's the other side of it, though. Okay,
yes,
that was just reason number one.
Okay.
Reason number one is the creative muscles atrophied. I mean, there was a day where all the best art was created by people who at least claimed to be Christians.
Sure.
Whether it was music or sculpture or painting, but art was considered glorifying to God. Okay, movies, TV, radio, because it was so related with burlesque and really big city vice. That Christians got out of that whole thing and really abandoned it to the devil. This is of the devil. We're giving it back to the devil. I mean, my great-grandfather was one of the first radio preachers in America. In 1923, he went on the radio and preached every Sunday until 1963. Early on, he got letters from people saying, you have to get off the radio because the Bible says the devil is the spirit of the air, quote unquote, the Lord of the air. And you're preaching through the airwaves, so that's obviously satanic. So we weren't even supposed to do radio.
Damn radio evangelists.
Argue with that one, I dare you.
Yeah. Radio evangelists.
And then here's the other part of it. You need to raise money from investors, and you need people to help you market your movie. The people that signed up early on to help market Christian movies were all pastors. And that was that was the target audience. Because if you can get pastors behind your film, they'll talk about it on Sunday, and then people will turn out, and you don't have to spend then $50 million on marketing, which you couldn't raise that much.
So you're suggesting people have a lot of heart behind this, but they don't necessarily have the Hollywood brain power necessary?
There's that, but pastors want something very specific from a movie if they're going to get excited about it. Pastors want a movie that is an evangelism opportunity. So they want a movie that has a clear presentation of the gospel so that if you invite your non-Christian friends to go, they will be floored by how clearly they've been presented the gospel, and they'll fall on their knees in the theater lobby and they'll come to Jesus. That's what pastors get excited about. Now, the fact that almost never happens,
right? And
that people that aren't looking for a message about Jesus will never pay $10 to get one if they've been warned. But if there's no overt, and that's why, I mean, do you know who the Kendrick brothers are?
I don't know. Sorry.
Okay, they are right now the most successful Christian filmmakers. They made Facing the Giants, Fireproof.
Okay. I have heard of those movies for what it's worth.
Yeah. I haven't, sorry.
So the Christian movies that have made the most money were made by the Kendrick brothers. The Kendrick brothers are actually ordained pastors from Georgia. They worked at a church. Their first three movies were funded by the church where they worked and starred people from the church congregation and were staffed by the church congregation. They were catered by the old ladies in the church, so the movies were literally church projects. So they were like sermons shot on video, but all no professional cast, no professional crew. And they started out really terrible. But the two guys, the Kendrick brothers, Alex and Stephen, maybe, or is he a Baldwin brother? I may be mixing up my brothers. They actually have pretty good storytelling chops. So the films have gotten better over time, but they still go back to the fact that we're ordained pastors making movies for ordained pastors, because that's how the marketing machine works in the Christian world. So if it's not overtly religious with a come to Jesus moment and a look, Jesus made my dream come true, and now you get into a little bit, is there prosperity gospel coming up in Christian movies that go over better? I mean, why do Joel Osteen's books sell better than more thoughtful pastors' books?
Right.
Because there's a heavy dose of wish fulfillment in them.
Well, let me push back a little bit on this, because movies like, I have no doubt that they look professional, they tell a good story, but yes, they are preachy. But here's what I don't get. Movies like God's Not Dead, or the sequel. I mean,
Left Behind,
which we talked
We did
about,
on the
Saw.
show.
Left Behind doesn't count.
Sorry. We'll put that one off the table.
But I feel like
The Nicolas Cage version. There's only that one. What other versions are there? No, here's what I'm getting at. The God's Not Dead. I mean, some of these movies are intended to try to convert people or intended to reach beyond the Christian audience and stuff. And God's Not Dead did very, very well in terms of, making back their money and then a ton. But like, even those movies, I would think, strategically speaking, if you're less heavy-handed, if you're less reliant on stereotypes, you might actually get to accomplish your goal of trying to reach people with the message of Christianity. And I'm not saying you, Phil, but in general.
Yeah.
And what I don't get is when they're so heavy-handed with these messages, it seems to backfire. And of course, I mean, look, if you bring up God's Not Dead in the atheist world, you'll get a laugh, because that's all it's good for in our world. And I would think we're kind of part of the audience they wanted to reach, and they failed miserably at that. If they were more subtle about it. Yes.
Can I be honest?
Please.
I don't think
they were trying to reach you.
They were trying to reach what? Christians who could have been strengthened in their faith?
Youth groups.
Okay.
Youth group kids that are headed for college and are in danger of losing their faith. And what God's Not Dead.
Did it work for them? Did it work for those youth group kids, do you think, who were...
I have not the thoughtful ones.
I mean, but that's what I'm getting at, right? Okay, you're right. It wasn't reaching out to atheists. But like, even for the thoughtful Christian kids who can see it and say, those don't resemble the atheists I know. That doesn't represent the Christians I know.
But you're right. But if you are, if you're in the South, you're in a big church, you're in the youth group, you've never met an atheist. It is a very reassuring picture to have painted for you that atheists are A, angry, and B, wrong.
Well,
that is reassuring, and that brought people into that movie in droves, because it's really, and this is part of the reason that most of my friends in Christian media would never go see one of those films, because we don't agree with them at all. It's a quasi-Christian wish fulfillment fantasy. They're closely related to Disney movies for kids, where hey, if you work hard enough, all your dreams can come true. No matter what, because Disney said so.
And if you stand up against your atheist professor, you're going to convert him.
Yeah, if you pray hard enough.
He's just mad at God.
God will show up and miracles will happen and all your dreams will come true. It's Disney wish fulfillment fantasy that's kind of been Christianized. And most thoughtful Christian reviewers just write scathing reviews of those films.
They're hilarious to read.
Phil, the way you put it makes sense, because they've set up it's a straw man of a movie. Like, it paints atheists as these very two-dimensional. It's not that he doesn't believe in God; he's just mad at God. So all you have to do is it was a PowerPoint presentation, I think, that finally got him over the edge. But it makes sense, because most atheists aren't just mad at God. Hey, dog,
hang on,
you can smell the atheist.
My dog barking. Get that dog out of here.
We're a professional show.
So, we don't
How
have
dare
dogs
you?
barking on our Atheist podcast. No, sir. So I apologize for much of, and should we start on Christian television? In most of media, what your ultimate, and this is secular or religious, ultimately your audience is who will bring back the money to repay your investors. Mm-hmm. And this is the problem with Christian television, because it's donor driven. It's not commercial. It's donor driven. And what brings in donations is preaching to appealing to the fears or the desires of very elderly rural Christians. So you shape your programming to accomplish what keeps you in business.
There was an era where televangelists were all the rage, and those people still exist, no doubt. But I have to think, like the Pat Robertson supporters, the whoever else is out there, their donors, their supporters, they probably won't be around in another generation or something. What's the next phase of Christian media? Where will Christians try to preach to the masses?
Yeah, that's online. Online, most likely. I mean, some of the best stuff that's being done, there's an effort called the Bible Project, which is a couple of fairly young, very thoughtful pastors in Portland, I believe, Portland or Seattle. And they're doing little animated, narrated, not like kid animated, but, more like the whiteboard drawing out, explaining things animated, kind of like Khan Academy videos, but to explain theology, to explain the Bible. And they are extraordinarily well done. They fund them through crowdfunding. That's Kickstarter stuff. And they just put them up on YouTube for free. And they're getting, quite a few views. And I recommend them to anybody because they're so well done. That's happening. The major publishing houses, whether it's the Southern Baptist Publishing House, Lifeway, or Zondervan and some of the other ones, they're funding things for churches that end up some really nice video curriculum and video series for small groups that are quite well done. Christian TV has really historically been the realm of Pentecostals. It was primarily Pentecostals who launched Christian TV stations because I'm not exactly sure why, but
there's a lot of money in it if you're good.
They felt more comfortable promising miracles in return for donations.
Can I ask you something? Speaking of
most other denominations would.
Speaking of all that stuff, explain to me, if you can, Jim Bakker and his buckets of food.
What?
His buckets of food?
What the hell are you talking
Jim
about?
Bakker still has his show now. And
is this current? This is the new Jim Bakker?
Oh, yeah. And he goes on and he says, the apocalypse is coming, and when it comes, you will not be able to, go shopping. So I am selling giant buckets, 60-gallon buckets of, broccoli and cheese soup.
Yeah, well, that makes sense.
Of
I
course.
think Jesus told us to do that.
Well, yeah, because that's the only place you can get a bunch of soup is through a guy on the TV.
If anyone's listening and you don't know what I'm talking about, go look up Jim Bakker with 2 Ks and his buckets of food.
Once he finds out about Costco, he'll realize how pointless his current exercise is.
I want to circle back quickly to you rocking your way through the Bible with the puppets and such. Women in general don't get a super good rap in the Bible. I
would probably disagree with you there, but go on.
Okay. Well, let's go on my premise. But I mean, regardless, women aren't the lead of most of the stories. Do you ever feel like it's important to make sure that your young Christian girls also have a role model who is maybe looks or sounds like them instead of...
Yes, with VeggieTales, we singled out specifically female-led stories like Esther and Ruth, and we did a big thing on Ruth in What's in the Bible. I think, but what you also have to keep in mind and teach to kids, because when you teach history, especially ancient history, there are very few leading women in ancient history because it's not how the ancient world worked. The ancient world was patriarchal, and typically it was run by whoever was the strongest and could pull together the most other strong guys to follow them around and beat other people up. So it became very difficult for women to lead in an ancient world that was male strength dominated. And the Bible is placed in the ancient world. That's where those stories are set. So we try to go out of our way to say, this is what the women did in this day because, and then explain the background. For example, you needed numbers to survive. In the ancient world, you needed numbers to survive. When it was tribal, before there was the rule of law, you couldn't survive without numbers. So the more babies you could make in a tribe, the better, which kept the women very, very busy, because that was really what they were there for, was to produce numbers. And that's why they were viewed, they were viewed highly, but not in terms of leadership, in terms of productivity. In that the bigger we can grow this tribe, the better the chance we all have of surviving.
But do you think that's Go ahead. Oh, do you think that's a good story to be telling our girls? Is that you're important, but you're mostly important to rack out babies. And,
no, we're talking about the ancient world. It's very.
But do you think they understand if you're talking about
history? You can't say, and this was the queen that ran ancient Greece. Was it? It was a guy.
I think she's asking, like, instead of just retelling the story, and this is what they were viewed as, and this is how they were honored as mothers, as baby producers, whatever. When you're sharing that story today, what message are you sending with that type of story?
You're trying to explain why in history we needed, women's rights. Why, and then you can explain what happened. See, I think there's a profound story to tell about the effect of Christianity on women in Europe, even in the Victorian era, when men were taught by the church primarily that they could and should control themselves. And, the Western world, and if you compare what it's like to be a woman in England to what it's like to be a woman in Saudi Arabia, there's a huge difference. And part of it came down to teaching men that they were not animals, that they were higher than animals and they could control themselves. And the notion of the Christian gentleman and then the Christian lady developed, in the West, which were kind of breaking down and becoming a little more animalistic in some ways, especially Donald Trump. But we tend to forget that. There's the English historian that just put out the book saying he now recognizes that he owes that liberal Western ethics owes much more to Christianity than to ancient Greece and ancient Rome. The difference between ancient Greece and modern West is much greater ethically in terms of how you treat people, how you treat women, how you treat minorities, how you treat the least of these. And he's become absolutely convinced that it was really Christianity that made that turn, not necessarily the Enlightenment per se, and definitely not ancient thinking.
But you cited the Victorian era specifically. That was a time that women were expected to be completely covered.
Because out of respect to men who were trying to learn how to control themselves. Mm-hmm. Men were completely covered too.
Yeah, that's a good point.
I mean, my grandfather could not swim without a shirt. He was not allowed to.
Jeez.
Because that's not what a Christian gentleman did. So it kind of cut both ways. It wasn't the kind of scenario you see, in the Muslim world where men are in Speedos and women are in burqas.
Well, you touched on it, so I think it's time for us to jump into what the hell's going on in this election campaign. And so Trump is inexplicably still doing okay with evangelical Christians. Yeah. Can you speak to that for me?
Yeah, what's going to happen with this world? What is happening? Why are they supporting him? And I'm really curious, what's going to happen after this election when you got to reckon with whatever happens?
Yeah. We've had Russell Moore on our show. He's the head of the Evangelical Religious Liberty Commission for the Southern Baptists, staunchly against Trump, has been from day one. I really don't understand the people who've come out in favor of Trump. There has been quite a bit of research done that the way pollsters use the term evangelical renders it almost meaningless because it's a self-identified term and not a behavior or a belief identified term. So fewer evangelicals support Trump than the polls would lead one to believe when Barna, does research and they base it on beliefs rather than just self-selection. It's a much different picture. But the bottom line is we've got about 2 generations of conservative Christians now have been taught that the Republican Party is the party of God and the Democratic Party is the party of abortion and the devil. And so they cannot bring themselves to vote for a Democrat. You also have the Clinton family, which has been associated pretty closely with the devil as well because of Bill's behavior in the office. And I don't quite understand why Hillary is as disliked as she is.
No, I
agree. But she really is.
It is weird, though, that they're going after Bill Clinton for his infidelity, but Donald Trump seems to get a pass with the same type of people.
And worse. He's done much worse, I'd argue.
But I mean, after this election
we're not there. We're not there. I mean, this guy Jitani, my co-host, is actually teaching an adult Sunday school class at our church for 4 weeks on politics. And this Sunday, actually, it's this week's podcast episode because we kind of repeated it for our podcast this week, is telling the history of the religious right.
Oh, interesting.
Where did it come from and how did we go? Okay, about 70 years ago, most African Americans were Republicans and most Southern whites were Democrats. And today they've flipped. Most African Americans are Democrats and most Republicans or most Southern whites are Republicans. How that happened is an extraordinary story. It has very little to do with Christianity per se and a whole lot to do with segregation, integration, and states' rights, you know, and the offenses in the South of the federal government telling them they had to integrate schools against their will. And unfortunately, and I had always thought that really the religious right was about Roe v. Wade. And as Sky, you know, really dug into the history, it was, no, it's not about Roe v. Wade. It was all about the federal government suing Bob Jones University because they hadn't integrated by 1976. They were still segregated and taking away their tax-exempt status. And that's what led Jerry Falwell and his partner to launch the Moral Majority. Not that they were fighting for segregation, but they were fighting against the notion that the federal government could tell a Christian university what they could and couldn't do. They hated that, and that generated all across the South this kind of rejection of the power of the federal government, you know, which there was still a little of that latent from the Civil War, but it came up again with integration of schools and with telling a Christian university what it could and couldn't do. The problem was that got very little traction with Northern Christians because we never really had an issue with integration. And so it didn't work with Northern Christians. They couldn't build a national voting bloc out of conservative Christians unless they found an issue that resonated with Northern Christians, which turned out to be abortion. And it wasn't 1973, it was 1980 when Northern Christians first got inflamed about Roe v. Wade and joined Southern Christians in this, you know, we have to take back America. And it's a fascinating story, but it all started with Bob Jones University losing its tax-exempt status because it wouldn't integrate in 1976.
So I think that's such an interesting, I think the flip between where liberalism has been is really, really fascinating. What I'm curious now is looking forward, because yes, you're right. For my entire lifetime, certainly the GOP has been the religious right, the moral majority, all that stuff. Where we've landed now, though, is like it's hard to even. I read an article today about somebody saying like all of the stereotypes about Republicans have actually come true. Like about it's not about Christianity, it's not about this, it's about Donald Trump is by no means a moral leader in any sense of the word. Right. So what's the justification there now?
Where does it go from here? Do you think? Well,
I mean,
the younger generation of evangelical Christians were discovering they're much less partisan than their parents. So there's probably going to be an abandonment of the Republican Party by, you know, millennials and under. Still, abortion is such a huge issue in conservative circles that it's very hard for a lot of people to get over that. You know, they've become just single issue voters. And that's, you know, a lot of Christian leaders are trying to push back on that and say, hey, there's more, you know, there's more to being pro-life than just before they're born. There's after they're born, there's poverty, there's immigration. The fact that so many people who say they are followers of Jesus are so anti-immigrant, you know, anti-Syrian immigrant, anti-Muslim is just astonishing to most pastors. I mean, 95% of evangelical pastors were against Donald Trump during the presidential primary. Now, when it just came down to, okay, what if it's just Donald Trump or Clinton? And it was like, oh, crap, this is the worst case scenario. And a lot of it then came down to Supreme Court. It's Supreme Court. You know, the America's going to hell in a handbag. We're losing our religious liberties. We're losing everything. And only the Supreme Court could turn it one way or the other. And so so we're becoming, mono issue voters really entirely. And they're members of my own family that have come to this position. They just have to hold their noses and vote for Trump because of the Supreme Court.
I actually understand the Supreme Court argument.
I do too.
That means you're voting, evangelicals are voting for Donald Trump, and that's going to backfire on them at some point, I would think.
Several. Christianity Today just ran an editorial, 2 weeks ago that was picked up pretty broadly, where they basically said that's idolatry. To make the Supreme Court that important. You're saying God can't accomplish his will unless you have conservative justices on the Supreme Court, and that's ridiculous. The Christianity Today also called. And they never weigh in on presidential candidates because they try to stay neutral, partly because they're a 501c3 religious organization. Sure. And, there's some question about whether it's even legal for them to endorse a candidate. So they've never endorsed a candidate, and they still didn't endorse a candidate this year. But they wrote a long editorial saying Donald Trump, and this was my favorite quote, is the biblical definition of a fool. And even then, it's not really moving the needle, which is scary. How many, not necessarily just conservative Christians, but conservative Americans have grown to distrust any voice of authority, quote unquote, or expertise, quote unquote, or journalism.
Yeah,
so that even if it's a conservative Christian journalistic voice, it's like, oh, well, that's the media. We don't trust them anymore. We don't trust anyone anymore except our Facebook friends.
Yeah, it's very, very bizarre that there's been just this absolute, as much as we're constantly connected to the media, like you said, Facebook and Twitter, et cetera, but people are so mistrustful of the New York Times.
They're in their bubble. But nothing outside the bubble matters.
Yeah, but even he said, somebody said something I slightly disagree with, and it's from a source I would trust 98% of the time. Well, this is one time they are full of shit. I don't know. Why don't... I don't know what's happening.
Can I ask one more?
It's scary, and it's. I read a long piece about the Southern Baptist Convention, the denomination, and how influential it's been. Not just in the South, but everywhere. There's a Southern Baptist kind of thought. And in general, I have a lot of Southern Baptist friends, and I've done work with the convention itself. But there's a distrust of. Northern politics, northern leaders, northern, media. So New York, LA, there's a distrust of the coasts and the notion that the heartland is where goodness lives. And because so much of the experts in the media, they're Yankees, and they're in Hollywood. It's really easy to write them off. And this is actually, there are significant Southern Baptist populations in Oregon, in Minnesota. It's kind of weird that there's Southern Baptists in Minnesota, but there are. The influence has really been intense in spreading a general mistrust of, Yankee expertise, which includes Washington and the federal government. And it's hard to figure out how to turn that around.
We have to wrap up. I have one more quick question for you. What does the creator of VeggieTales have to say about Sausage Party?
Christ.
Have you seen it? What do you think about it?
No, I haven't seen it. Sometimes you have to have lines. It's not cool to have lines where you say, I don't go there. I'm sure it's funny. I went and saw the Book of Mormon.
Yeah.
Just because I'd heard so much about it. I listened to some of the music. I'm fans of the South Park guys, not necessarily because of how crude they can be, but just because of how clever they are.
Yeah.
So I bought myself a ticket, went to see the Book of Mormon, and it made me uncomfortable because I'm sitting, downtown Chicago, well-dressed crowd, a city crowd, intellectual, well-educated, and they're laughing their heads off at jokes that are being made at the expense of a minority religion. And it's just, I couldn't get comfortable with that. So I have a hard time with things that are so coarse or so, using disrespect of minority points of view. And I don't mean racial minorities, but any kind of minority.
Though to be fair, for Book of Mormon, from my understanding of it, plenty of Mormons saw it and laughed their asses off too. Because they were, it was the jokes were. By the end. It was. A lot of Mormons would tell you that's a pro-Mormonism musical. Like it pokes fun at our people, but it is done out of love because these people are very devout. So I don't know that Book of Mormon was necessarily mocking. You saw in it what you wanted to see in it.
Well, of course it was mocking Mormonism because Trey and Matt hate Mormonism. They've mocked it in South Park.
They've mocked atheism too. I mean, they mock everybody.
Yeah, they hate lots of things.
Yeah.
I don't think they hate those things.
It was the polite culture. There's, and I think Trump is kind of all part and parcel of this, of a breakdown of civility and kind of a joyousness in our rejection. We're so happy to be away from Victorian mores and norms. We're so happy to have rejected that kind of the Christian ethic of 19th century England. That we're just running away from it as fast as we can, and we've decided that you can't say it's wrong to be crass ever because you're going backwards and not forwards.
See, I think that's not true.
Getting accustomed to that much crassness isn't good for civilization.
But here's the thing. The things that Trump said, grab her by the pussy or whatever, that's been defended by conservatives who are touting
or not dismissed or not. It wasn't a disqualifying statement. I'm gonna pause here because we are out of time. And Phil, we could definitely.
No, we're not. We can go all night.
We can definitely continue this with you.
No, Chris is doing the arm motion. Keep going.
I have a baby to get home to.
Yeah.
So
that baby.
I know. Sorry. But Phil, thank you for being with us. I know we could continue this, and I hope we do in the near future. Thank you so much for joining us. You live around here, right, Phil?
What? Pardon me?
You live in the
general vicinity of us.
I do. I do. I'm just north of you. So, whenever you want to get together, let's get together. I do enjoy, if there are stupid things that Christians do and you just want some Christian to attempt to defend them or not,
nothing would make me happier.
Call me up because it's kind of fun.
Man, Phil, I'm going to take you up on that. Thank you so much for your time.
You're welcome.
Thanks for listening to the podcast for FriendlyAtheist.com. This episode was taped at Cinnamon Sound Studios in Aurora, Illinois, and the music was written and performed by Brad Chagdis. If you like what you're hearing, please consider making a contribution at patreon.com/Hemant, that's He-Man T. We appreciate your support. I'm Hemant Mehta.
And I'm Jessica Blumke. We hope you'll join us next time.